The moment my brother slid that folder across the boardroom table, he was already smiling, not a polite smile. The kind that tells you someone has been rehearsing this scene for a long time. My father had been gone for 11 days. The lawyer's office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Calgary, the kind of place where the carpet is thick enough to muffle everything, including bad news. My brother sat to the left of the lawyer, my mother beside him. My wife had stayed home with our daughter. I had come alone, which I would later understand was exactly what my brother had counted on. The will, as it turned out, had been updated 4 months before my father died. I had not known that. My brother had. My father built Ashford Mechanical over 31 years. He started it in a rented bay in the northeast end of the city with 2 used lifts, a second-hand diagnostic computer, and a reputation for never cutting corners. By the time I was old enough to work summers there, we had 3 locations, a fleet account with a provincial carrier, and enough steady contracts that my father could have retired at 60 if he'd wanted to. He didn't want to. He liked the work. He liked the smell of the shop, the way a problem had a solution if you looked carefully enough, the satisfaction of something running the way it was supposed to. I grew up in that business. My brother didn't. He had other interests, other ambitions, a finance degree, a condo in Kensington, a way of talking about the company as though it were a portfolio asset, rather than a place where my father had spent his life. That distinction mattered more than I realized. For most of my adult life, I believed our family operated in good faith. Differences in personality, sure. Tension at holidays occasionally. But nothing that prepared me for what I heard in that office, with the winter light coming flat through the west-facing windows, and my brother's lawyer sitting quietly with his hands folded, like he'd done this before. The updatable gave my brother 60% of Ashford Mechanical. It gave me the property in Bragg Creek. That was a 40-acre parcel my father had owned since the 90s, mostly trees, a creek running through the south end, and a small cabin he'd used for fishing weekends. It's nice land, quiet land, land worth at the time of his death, somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000, depending on who you asked. Ashford Mechanical, by contrast, had been valued 18 months earlier at just over $4 million. My brother looked at me the way people look at someone they've already written off. I didn't say anything. I sat there in that thick carpeted room, and I let the lawyer finish reading, and when he was done I thanked him for his time, shook hands, and walked to the elevator. My mother caught up to me in the lobby. She put her hand on my arm and said the property was beautiful, that Dad had always loved it, that he would have wanted me to have something personal rather than something complicated. She said my brother was better suited to running the business. She said she hoped I understood. I told her I did. I didn't. But I had learned something from my father, something that had nothing to do with engines or shop management. He used to say that the worst decisions you ever make are the ones you make when you're angry. That anger makes you loud and loud makes you wrong. He wasn't a man who raised his voice. In 30 years of running a business, I never once heard him shout at an employee. He spoke quietly, moved carefully, and made his choices after he'd had time to think. I drove home on Deerfoot with my hands steady on the wheel, and my mind doing something I hadn't expected. It was going very, very still. My name is Scott Hargreaves, and I spent most of my life believing that if you worked honestly and kept your head down, things would balance out eventually. I was an estimator at my father's company for 9 years, then operations manager for 4. I knew every supplier relationship, every fleet account, every long-standing client. I knew which contracts were coming up for renewal, and which ones had been quietly at risk for the past 2 years. I knew the company better than my brother knew his own phone number. What I didn't know, until I started looking, was how long the groundwork had been laid. My father's health had declined faster than any of us expected. A diagnosis in the spring, a rapid progression through summer, and by September he was spending most of his time at home. My brother visited frequently during that period, more than he had in years. He was attentive, helpful, present in a way that I had told my wife was a good sign, that maybe something about facing mortality was bringing the family closer. I was wrong about that too. A colleague of mine, a woman who'd done contract accounting for the company for years, called me 2 weeks after the reading of the will. She'd heard through someone at the firm. She was careful about what she said, but careful in the way people are when they want you to understand something without having to say it plainly. She suggested I look into the timeline of the will revision. She suggested I look into who had accompanied my father to the appointment. My father had not driven himself anywhere in the last 6 months of his life. I hired a lawyer in Edmonton. Not Calgary, Edmonton, because I wanted distance from anyone who might have a connection to my brother's network. She was quiet and thorough, and she had a way of asking questions that made you feel like she'd already seen the answer and was simply confirming it. Within 3 weeks, she had confirmed that my brother had driven my father to the notary's office, that my father's GP had noted concerns about cognitive decline in his file as early as July, that the revision had taken place in August. My lawyer used the words undue influence and testamentary capacity in the same sentence without any particular drama, the way you'd describe a repair that needed doing. I want to be precise about something here because it matters. What I'm describing isn't a story about hating my brother or wanting to punish my family. What I felt sitting in my lawyer's office in Edmonton listening to those words wasn't rage. It was something quieter and more unsettling. It was the specific grief of realizing that people you loved had decided, at some point, that you didn't count enough to be honest with. That grief is different from anger. It's harder to move through, and it leaves a different kind of mark. I told my wife everything that evening, sat at the kitchen table in our house in Airdrie with the kids already in bed, and she listened without interrupting, which is one of the things about her that I have always depended on. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What do you want to do?" I told her I wasn't sure yet. She said, "Whatever you decide, we're okay. Just decide for the right reasons." I thought about that for a long time. The next morning, I drove out to Bragg Creek. I hadn't been to the property since before my father got sick. It was late November, the creek half frozen, the aspens bare. The cabin needed work, a new section of roof, some weatherproofing around the foundation, nothing structural. I walked the property for about an hour, following the creek south to where it bent around a stand of spruce. And when I came back, I sat on the steps of the cabin and looked at the land, and I thought about my father. He had bought this land because he liked the quiet. He came out here when he needed to think. He never talked about it as an investment, never mentioned development potential or future value. He talked about the way the light came through the trees in the early morning in July, and how you could hear the creek from the cabin when it rained. Standing there, I tried to decide what he would have wanted me to do. What I decided was that he would have wanted me to be careful. Not careful in the sense of passive or accepting, but careful in the sense he always meant it. Precise, methodical, no wasted motion. I went back to my lawyer. The next several months were not dramatic. They were paperwork and phone calls and a quiet accumulation of documentation that my lawyer assembled with a patience that I came to deeply respect. We were not making noise. We were building a case, and cases are built in silence. Meanwhile, my brother took operational control of Ashford Mechanical. I watched from a distance, which was uncomfortable but instructive. He brought in a friend of his to help with management, someone with no background in the trades, no understanding of how fleet contracts worked, no relationships with the suppliers my father had cultivated over decades. Within 4 months, 2 of our oldest accounts had put out requests for competing bids. One of them, a regional trucking company out of Red Deer that had been with us since the mid-90s, moved their contract to a competitor in the spring. I heard about it from my former colleague, who was still doing contract work for the company. She called me on a Wednesday evening, and I could hear in her voice that she felt bad about it, that she'd watched that account for years and understood what it represented. I thanked her. I didn't say anything else. What I was learning, slowly, was that the business my brother had maneuvered to control was not the business he had imagined it to be. The value of Ashford Mechanical had never been in the equipment or the leases or the brand. It had been in the relationships, the institutional knowledge, the culture my father had built over 30 years of treating people decently. Those things don't transfer in a will. They go with the people who hold them. My brother had won the shell. I had known in some part of myself for months that this was true. What I hadn't expected was how quickly it would become visible to everyone else. There's a particular feeling that comes when events move the way you quietly believed they would, not satisfaction. Exactly. More like a somber confirmation. Like watching a storm arrive that you felt in the pressure days before. The legal challenge proceeded through the following year, with no publicity and no confrontation. My lawyer was thorough, and the documentation was solid. In the fall, 14 months after the reading of the will, the matter was settled through mediation. I won't detail the full terms because some of them are confidential, but I'll say this. The outcome was materially different from the original will. The Bragg Creek property remained mine. Several other arrangements changed. By the time the settlement was finalized, Ashford Mechanical had lost another major account and was carrying debt it hadn't had under my father. My brother had invested his own money to cover operating shortfalls. The business that had been valued at $4 million 18 months earlier was worth considerably less and declining. I was not involved in its operations. I had not been asked to be, and I did not offer. My mother called me the week after the settlement. It was the first real conversation we'd had in over a year. She started by saying she hadn't known, and I let her finish that sentence before I said anything, because I thought it was important to hear exactly how she framed it. What she said was that she hadn't understood what your brother was doing, not that she hadn't been present, not that she had objected. I noticed that. I didn't point it out. What I said was that I Hope was taking care of herself, that I would always be her son, that some things had changed, and I needed time to understand what that meant going forward. She cried. I had not expected that, and I didn't know what to do with it except to stay on the line until she stopped. There's a version of this story that ends with a reckoning, a confrontation where everything is said plainly and the people who did harm are made to understand the full weight of it. I used to think I wanted that. I thought about those conversations more times than I can count, all the things I would say, if I had the chance, the precise, devastating articulation of every moment of disrespect and every choice that was made at my expense. What I found after the settlement was that I didn't want those conversations anymore, not because I'd forgiven everything or let go of anything, but because I'd realized something about what I actually needed. I didn't need them to understand. I needed to stop measuring my life by whether they did. That sounds simple. It wasn't. It took longer than the legal process, and it required a different kind of work, the kind you can't hire someone to do for you. The Bragg Creek property had sat mostly unused during all of this. I'd done the basic maintenance, kept the cabin weathertight, but hadn't spent much real time there. In the spring following the settlement, I started going out regularly. Weekends with my wife and daughter, early mornings on my own when I needed quiet. I did some work on the cabin myself, not because I needed to, but because I found I wanted to, that there was something useful in working with my hands on a thing that was mine. My father had left a fishing rod in the cabin, a telescoping travel rod, nothing special, stored in a tube on the shelf above the door. I started using it in the mornings along the creek. I'm not a skilled fisherman, I don't catch much. I'm not sure that's the point. There's something he used to say that I've thought about often. He'd say it at the end of hard days, when something at work had gone sideways or a customer had been unreasonable or a supplier had let him down. He'd say, the job isn't finished, but the day is. It was his way of separating what was still unresolved from what needed rest. The job would be there tomorrow. You didn't solve anything by carrying it to bed with you. I didn't understand that when I was younger. I do now. My brother and I are not close. I don't expect that will change. The relationship we had before all of this was already built on something I misunderstood, a kind of surface fraternity that I mistook for something deeper. I've had to be honest with myself about that. It's easier to be angry at someone for taking something than to acknowledge that you never fully saw them clearly to begin with. My mother and I speak occasionally, holidays sometimes, not with the ease we had before and probably not ever with that ease again, but not with hostility either. She is getting older. She made choices I don't fully understand and may never understand. She is still my mother. I think about my father often, especially out at the property. I think about the version of events where I stood up in that boardroom and said everything I was thinking, made my displeasure known, argued in real time. I think about how satisfying that would have felt for about 48 hours, and what it would have cost me in the time that followed. My father taught me the business by having me work every part of it, not just the parts I was comfortable in. He put me on reception one summer, answering phones and booking appointments, because he said if you didn't understand how customers came in the door, you'd never understand how they left. He put me on the shop floor before he put me in the office. He didn't explain himself much. He just put you in the place where learning was available and trusted you to do the rest. I think about the will differently now than I did at first. I think my father, in his final months, was not entirely himself. I think my brother understood that and chose to act on it. I also think my father would have been appalled by that choice. I've stopped trying to resolve those two things into a single clean narrative because they don't resolve. Some things just sit alongside each other. The man who built that business with honesty and patience, and the documents that were signed in August, both of those things are true, and neither cancels the other. What I held on to, through all of it, was something ordinary. My daughter started kindergarten this September after the settlement. I took the morning off work to walk her to school. A thing I almost didn't do because there was a deadline I was managing. My wife told me the deadline could move, so I walked her to school, and she wore a backpack that was almost as big as she was, and she held my hand for about a block and a half, and then she let go because she wanted to walk on her own. That's what I remember most from that whole year. Not the settlement, not the phone call with my mother, that block and a half with my daughter's hand in mine, and then the moment she let go. You spend a lot of time, when things are falling apart, trying to hold on to things. The right outcome, the fair outcome, the acknowledgement you believe you're owed. What I learned eventually is that holding on costs you the things that are actually in your hands. You can't grip what's already gone and catch what's arriving at the same time. The job isn't finished, but the day is. What remains now is quieter than what I expected. The company I grew up in is struggling under management that doesn't understand it. That is genuinely sad, and I have made my peace with the sadness of it. The land in Bragg Creek is mine, and it's worth considerably more than anyone in that boardroom understood. Not because of any development potential, but because of what it meant to my father and what it has come to mean to me. Some values don't show up on an appraisal. I'm not the same person I was the morning I sat in that lawyer's office and heard the will read for the first time. I'm less certain about some things I used to take for granted and more certain about others. I know what I'll walk away from and I know what I won't. I know the difference between a fight worth having and a noise worth making. I know that my father's quietness wasn't weakness and it wasn't defeat. It was just a man who understood that how you move through difficulty says something about you that no outcome can take back. I'm still learning that, but I'm learning it out by the creek in the early mornings with a fishing rod that doesn't catch much and a view of the trees that my father used to drive 2 hours to see. That's enough. More than enough, actually. It just took me a while to understand that it was mine.